Welcome to Conversations on Healing and Growth. I'm Ben Umstead.
And I'm Martin Perkins. So today's episode is an exploration at a very core level into why work? What are your foundational reasons? But we're also inquiring beyond reason as to why you work. The feelings, the senses, the sense of calling, everything that makes up what it means for you when you hear that word work.
In holding these inquiries dearly and deeply, a lot of this will come through questions. We're going to share our personal experiences, but to begin with a question. If you were to step out onto the street in your town or your city and ask strangers, go up to them and say, what is your reason for work? Why do you work? I think that most of the time people would offer some kind of variation on, well, to make a living because I have to. I think that's such a common turn of phrase, especially here in the United States, right? Where we have this Protestant work ethic that goes beyond the religious dogma and is transformed into the office in this way where it's so inherent. So to make something, right? That's a beautiful thing. But there's a quality in the phrase to make a living that suggests a severing, I would offer, a compartmentalization in this notion of a living, as if it's something aspirational, something to strive for. But we're here right now. We're alive. So in this way, that striving, that aspiration, that severing occurs, or else it's an intrusion, right? Something that is seen outside of us, and yet it's intrinsically linked to how so many of us view ourselves, how we value ourselves. And this stuff isn't always embodied from a place of wisdom and joy, but it can be a major cause for, worry, anxiety, and frustration. Will I be able to pay off my debt by the end of the year? Can I afford groceries? Can I replace my broken dryer? Will I be able to afford childcare? So in that sense, we're encountering work through this, it being about survival. It can really be life-threatening. There are folks out there that must work to survive. And yet there's this absurd feedback loop inherent in work, right? I must go to work in order to have a roof over my head and food on the table so that I may go to work, to make a living, to survive.
That notion of survival, of living day to day, week to week, month to month, I can very much relate to it. And it's because I can relate to that, I want to communicate the fact that we can dwell, we can live with limited financial resources without also having to live in a state of toil, of great suffering, of in a survival mode, in the agitation of being in fight or flight. That we don't have to grind our way through life in order to bring the resources we need into our homes. That they're not inherently the same thing. For a lot of people, it feels that way, right?
Yeah, it's very much, well, it goes back to a narrative of severing, of isolation. Tens of millions of Americans lack adequate health care. And perhaps even more importantly than that, in terms of just daily well-being and community, many experience a less than vibrant social fabric. So in other words, we're not deeply connected to the world around us. Work can feel like the only viable and valuable outlet to the world then. So again, it gets back to that kind of absurd feedback loop. You don't necessarily want to go there, but it can be the only viable and valuable outlet despite feeling so shallow sometimes, exhaustive.
Right. As a result of what we have to invest into our work, We then have to look at the value of ourselves, the validity of the work we're doing, how we work. And, what you and I are seeking to do today is challenge each of our listeners to redefine the notion of work. At the core of this redefinition is what it means to be natural, with natural being something that is very individually defined. There is not a universal natural. If what we're saying about this notion of work is something you find yourself reacting to, stay with it. There's something here for you. So, along the way, we're going to revisit this practice of being natural. But for the time being, I just want to explore the many ways that we can see this notion of being natural through what is often articulated as a contradictory lens. We have the part of us that's rational. We have the part of us that's irrational. We have the part of us that's superficial. And we have the part of us that exists at great depths. All of us have this. Being natural helps give voice to all these parts, but especially the parts of us that rest deep within that often get the least amount of attention. And with that seed planted, let's move along in the conversation.
So when we consider work in its earliest expressions, from hunter-gatherer communities to the development of agriculture, we see a lot of indicators that this was a communal endeavor oriented around collective needs in most societies.
And in the West, this continued until the breakdown of the commons in the 1500s and the ensuing enclosure of goods and services. In other words, large corporations, large entities enclosing what was once mutually shared. And through capitalism came colonialism, came repression, came manufacturing in its various expressions around the world, right? Exploitative in nature, work was transformed into an endeavor where labor was seen as an expense to be minimized in order to maximize profit for those elites who held ownership. There was a cutthroat type of capitalism that has slowly sort of been cultivated from generation to generation to generation over hundreds of years, and has now reached a point where it's become so toxic that the workers of the world actually believe that the other workers are their competitors rather than their brothers and sisters. And at all costs, the capitalist seeks to prevent the worker from acting through a sense of community, otherwise known as a labor union, to represent their needs. Individualized notions of productivity are what the capitalist puts forth as the measure of our worth in our society, and therefore wealth determines our status.
So, speaking to the notion of status, we're in a moment right now where that's changing from what many people in the 20th century would have defined as a middle class lifestyle, right? This sense that you work and you're proud of your work and you go ahead and you put your resources into a family safety net and a communal safety net. And I think this is often where the idea of suburbia had a lot of validity to it. But when we just go to work and go home and go to work and go home, or go to school and go home, and we don't have all of those wonderful community activities and places to gather, this ties into the severing and the isolation that we've been noting. And the elites love that, because what that means is that they can begin, and they are right now, taking a lot of the jobs that require creativity and deep thinking and critical thinking, and they can leave the menial jobs. The menial jobs, they see you as a cog in the machine. This is the Silicon Valley ascension myth of optimization. If we can get a human to do all the little things and little checks and tasks as the machines do the really, really, really big picture things, then we can take all the profit. Again, it's minimizing labor down to its most shallow form. I think the irony here is that the machines that are supposed to ease a lot of these menial tasks just often make them feel more cumbersome due to a lack of oversight and poor programming and engineering. So many of the large language models are now just doing programming and engineering tasks that humans used to do, and there's a disconnect. There's a lack of accountability. But again, this speaks to the notion of many tasks being done, having to address all these little things that are seen as problems just to keep the individual worker occupied. It's busy work. Busy work justifies the employer's need for you to be working in a linear fashion for 40 hours a week, or as Elon Musk would want, 80 hours a week.
For the same pay.
For the same pay.
And while some jobs do require linear physical action, like, they require step-by-step processes like repairing brakes on a car, or are interactive, where we need to listen and share with others in real time. What many people find themselves doing at their desks for long stretches of the day is either some form of sorting, of thinking, and often overthinking, right? And because of the cognitive, somewhat invisible nature of this, people have a tendency to lapse into worry or anxiety around their need to be busy, to appear to be working. Otherwise, they feel as if they're not secure or safe in their job.
Yeah, this reminds me of my filmmaker friend Teddy Colados recently shot a new feature film, and there's a character in the film who works in a nondescript New York office, right? Well, this guy has devised a practice in which he naps sitting upright at his desk. And there's a whole scene where he's describing this to a new coworker. And so he's saying, this is how I do it. I've trained myself to nap at my desk and to have my finger move, the muscle movements. I practice them to scroll up and down on the mouse wheel so that it zooms in and out on a document. So this guy has literally put all of his intention into making it look like he's working in order not to work so that he can rest. I mean, the scene is super amusing. It's very clever because of the way it so simply illustrates the absurd pantomime so many people strive to create at the office.
Which is a tragedy inherent in our burnout society, where so many people need so much more rest than they're getting, right? In a nation where the safety nets are being removed, federal leadership feeds on the electorate's fear, and social media amplifies these fears in order to grow their followings. The inevitable result is a world where few people feel safe. And, this need for a sense of a mutually supportive community often feels far away in the constant hum, and ultimately leaves huge numbers of Americans exhausted and without the ability to truly relax into a sense of safety and ease. In fact, the oligarchs have acknowledged, they say it out loud, they don't want you to feel at ease. They don't want you to feel safe. They want you to feel agitated, because then you can't question anything in that agitated state and be effective.
Yeah, you're so tired, your ability to discern all of this is greatly eroded. And that's the thing here. We talk about safety and ease, and I'm actually realizing that, when we step into our collaboration together, that is a core question that, we're usually answering through other questions, through other means, through other actions. But that ease, the importance to be here with each other in this creative process with ease, is paramount, right? So it shows up in a lot of different ways. And to pull back the curtain on making the show, in writing this episode in particular, right, you and I spent a lot of time writing in parallel. So it doesn't always happen that way, but this time we were both on Zoom and we were talking with each other occasionally, checking in and asking questions, reading where we were at. But I would say, for 75% of the time, we were more or less just following our creative spirit and writing different sections without totally knowing what the other was doing yet, but knowing on an intuitive level that we would connect it. That's one way our collaboration shows up. It's a tapestry, I would offer. And we've developed that with each other over, 4 years at this point, right? 2 years doing the podcast. And before that, working on Language of the Soul, A Path of Simplicity, editing that, redrafting that, doing all these. So that's the thing. All of this is rooted in intuition and flexibility and communication, and definitely a willingness to play and be vulnerable with each other and to know when we need to rest, when we need to step away, and also to be okay with it being messy. Sometimes we don't understand what we're saying to each other and we have to say it again and reiterate things. There's clarification that happens. It's, being okay with the human experience, the human condition.
Right. And what you're in many ways speaking to is what I shared earlier about being natural.
Exactly. And, any regular listener out there is going to know that all of what we're saying is a reflection of our inner cultivation, right?
Right. To recognize that none of what we're describing exists in a static state. It's constantly changing, it's constantly evolving. And, I know in my own personal journey, that constant state of being willing to learn and in the process shed the shackles of this value judgment around my sense of self-worth and learning to reframe who I am, learning to genuinely love myself regardless of how others see my choices, to let go of the notion that my value system has to adhere to the principle that wealth dictates importance.
Ah, there's that again. And I resonate very deeply with what you're sharing here and what's transpired in your life. I know that in my own journey, though, at the same time, I'm in a moment of doubt on how to express this fully. In writing into our personal journeys and figuring out what we wanted to share with you all today, I was like, how do I really do this from an authentic place? And so that doubt reflects the tending of a core wound that I have. I often project it as being offended about the systemic power and usage of money. You can hear it in some of the things that I've shared today around oligarchs and elites and the nature of work. But truly, more deeply, at my core, it's about my own worth and my own belief in myself. And in this sense, how that translates into life under capitalism is curious. I've never pursued monetary wealth like you were talking about, Martin. And nor have I really had any traditional employment in terms of a 9-to-5 job. There have been a couple of brief periods. I figured in my 20s that this worked quite well, and even into my 30s. In recent years, as I've done my work and cultivated my practice and my own healing and growth, I've realized that I've been keeping myself small and away from changes and experiences that are needed in order for me to continually heal and grow. I need to be listening to what my soul is calling for. And in this moment, it's recognizing that to be natural is to be revelatory. And sometimes that means that things can feel bumpy and uncomfortable. And in the same moment that those things are feeling bumpy and uncomfortable, I can still feel joy. It's not a static thing like you noted.
Yeah. So, in the sense of the inner journey, nothing is mutually exclusive. I have chosen throughout my adult life to place growth, curiosity, new experiences at the front of my life choices. As a result, my life and professional practices have been, as you put a moment ago, have been far less evolutionary and more so revelatory in nature. This constant and ever-growing inner journey has revealed to me the next steps as both a conscious and intuitive expression of calling. And what that's led to, and the reason why I said it's been less evolutionary is that I'm not moving up these rungs of success. I'm moving into parallel experiences largely built around creative calling, right? And that's not to say that everyone will have my experience. But my point and our point is that every decision we make in how we invest our time and energy can point to creative opportunity, that every choice can be creative in nature, and that creative expression can lead to an ongoing refinement within our journey. So if my exploration of vocation, has led me from being an acupuncturist, an herbalist, to a consciousness teacher. I did a lot of body work very early in the first 10 years of my career in doing healing work, and has now led to more multifaceted roles where I'm working as well as an artist, as a crafter, as a builder of things. And then there's this entirely indifferent thing that I do with you as a podcaster, right? Kind of the whole picture of what I am as a human, kind of just putting it out there and talking about what's going on in the world and how does it pertain to healing and growth. Hopefully, guiding people into deeper conversations with themselves around what it means to be human. A guiding principle for me through this whole journey has been growing my experience through play, enjoyment, and embodied learning, right? I've chosen to focus on how I dance with the journey rather than what might be occurring at any given point. In other words, I focus on the how versus the what. The result of this journey in my so-called work life, in particular over the last 15 years, has been deeply gratifying. I wouldn't change a thing. I clearly see a path of deep learning that has fed me and those in my circles of connection in a myriad of ways. In other words, I believe that what I've learned, I've been able to share with others. And when such a journey is taken without a focus on financial wealth building, money or financial resources arrive differently because I'm not seeking to hoard resources, to build reserves. That's never really been my focus. So I've learned to do this creative thing I do without a big financial reserve in place. It's forced me to do something, which is to learn how to feel safe with or without the reserve, right? And to feel a sense of confidence and security in myself. And frankly, learning how to trust in the truth of my own journey, knowing that for me, that's inherently natural. And the resultant freedom that dwells from this practice is something that I've tried to explain in this conversation and in many other conversations. But the truth is, you really can't know what I'm describing until you know it through experience.
For us 15 years ago, you told me in a moment of great transition for me that was filled with, so much anger and so much doubt and so much fear. You said very simply, all I needed was more experience. This is important to note here because of the fear factor, the exhaustion, the doubt, the ability to discern, and the way that work, especially from a tech oligarch standpoint, is about eroding your discernment. What I was feeling there is all okay. And that was a part of the experience too, right? Being okay with those aspects. So in this sense, it wasn't really about failing or fear of failing. Failures would occur. They were simply a part of gaining experience for me in an embodied sense and to keep practicing with all the uncomfortable parts. That was hard for me to hear. And sometimes it still is. over the last 15 years and more, being a film journalist, being a film festival programmer, a filmmaker, podcaster, a dog sitter, because that's what you do in Los Angeles sometimes. And sometimes I volunteered my time. Sometimes I had my travel costs to a film festival covered. Sometimes I got paid what felt like pennies. And sometimes there was tension there because of that. Resentment there could build up. At the end of the day, I loved what I was doing and how I was doing it because it was simply about that love and joy and play. So again, it gets back to that what's natural? How do you want to play? So in those times of friction and tension when challenges would arise, well, that sense of joy and play, it was still there. I was still me. I was still being natural, especially when it hurt. And that can be an edge for me still. All of what I'm saying comes at a very interesting time in my life where the changes that are occurring mean that there are a lot of new experiences and new responsibilities and new questions and new challenges. For the first time in my life, I now have a salaried and full-time job as the director of programming and artist relations for the River Run International Film Festival. And that's the thing. This is what we're getting at through this episode. Our journeys are our cultivation, right? Me stepping into this new role as a director of programming is a reflection of the changes that I was cultivating. I got the job because my friend Michael Morin is River Run's executive director. And he asked me if I'd like to join him in helping to reshape the festival into a greater community experience. I didn't interview for this job.
Not in the formal sense. You had a body of knowledge and a shared experience with Michael, which was, I would suggest, far more in depth than any interview could be.
Michael knew me through experience, shared experience, the depth of it. And when I'm present and intentional, my journey unfolds and I meet myself where I am, and others like Michael see me as me, and we continue.
When I began my clinical internship as an acupuncturist 30 years ago, I was expressing a passion that served my natural instincts on multiple levels. It was a vocation that served others. It was a vocation that one can practice for a lifetime and still have a great deal more to learn. And lastly, it was one in which, after you've completed your schooling, you could apply for licensure, and then you go out the next day and hang a acupuncture shingle, right? Martin Perkins, acupuncturist. It gave me a lot of options as to how I wanted to go about doing it, right? And lastly, it provided this path of service that helped me to heal and grow for the last 3 decades. Because yes, my clients were served by my services, but I was as well served by their presence. Over those 30 years, I've had stages where my practice was incredibly full, and I've had periods where it's ebbed and flow, right? At no point along the way did I think, when it was slow, oh, that's a problem, or when it was too busy, this is too much. I just kind of flowed with it, right? I made decisions around how I would practice that determined as well the flow. I decided very early on that I was unwilling to accept third-party reimbursement. In other words, I wouldn't accept insurance money directly. And that played as well a large role in how my practice would grow. For me, that was an ethical decision that was easy for me to make and continue to make. It also allowed me to have space at times to explore new things when the practice ebbed. I'm really grateful for those times when things slowed down a bit. It led me to new experiences. Often when things per se slow down, the first thing that I hear people want to do is try to quicken the pace again instead of stepping into the pause and being like, What's this opportunity to explore about? And, often people are like, oh, I've got to fix this. I've got to build my business so it's bigger, faster, whatever, right? Instead of where might this lead me? I know for me, 15 years ago, 16, 17 years ago, it began to lead me in new directions that ultimately led to me doing a lot more teaching work and began to teach the language of the soul coursework. And then, over the last 12 years, I've been teaching that work. And then the embodiment of that work led to the writing of the book, right? And the writing of the book then led ultimately into our work with this podcast. For the last 20 something years, I've been living on 5 acres, and, there's a lot of gardening, there's tending, caring for the land, there's, chicken wrangling, and there's a lot of building I've done. I expanded my office. I built a workshop out of a pony barn. I built a tree house. I learned to do things with my hands that was incredibly gratifying. And it led me down yet a new path of learning. And it felt like I found within myself kind of grieving an old story. Just that I didn't have creative talent, right? That was a really old story that I had bought into. I didn't know how to do anything creative. And these last 20 plus years has been this like journey of learning how to create my natural version of how to create beauty, right? That nourishes me, and my hope is it nourishes others. But of even greater importance as this unfolded was learning to transform these learnings out of one of toil and into one that's based in creativity, in play, in joy, and ultimately, and probably most importantly, an expression of life that feels inherently natural. And, to that end, I want to introduce to you, our audience, the concepts and the practices that accompany those concepts that can help you learn how to be natural with yourself. I mean, a lot of these are born out of experience, but they're also born out of a particular teacher's work, which is a man named Osho, and in particular, his book, Tantra, The Supreme Understanding. There's a lot written in the world about Osho, and we could go down that road and we could be talking for the next 2 hours about Osho. But that's not my point. I've been practicing with these concepts and these practices for nearly 20 years, and I found wondrous benefit in my own well-being. I want as well point out that these concepts and practices have been the lens through which we've shared this entire podcast. And so the first is, in terms of concepts, there's no ideal image. Trying to be good, trying to be special. It just creates more ego, which in turn creates more limitations on the possibility of who we can be, right? Because the ego wants to define, concretize. And the soulful part of us, the irrational part of us, what I would suggest is our true nature, wants to help us learn to accept who we are right now without the need to compare. The second concept is learning how to drop your conditioning, to take society and religion's teachings and the ways in which these doctrines and dogmas inherently fight with our own instincts and our own body, creating inner division and tension. And I personally have found that meditation and journaling have been extraordinary tools in helping me to drop my sense of conditioning. And then lastly, relaxation and flow. Learning to be natural is in many ways identical to total relaxation. Moving without being hurried, without fear, without the constant need to protect a sense of what I would call false identity. Learning to relax into being who you are in this moment, right? And there are very practical steps that we can employ to reveal what is natural for us. And we can begin with listening to the body. How am I behaving? And how is my body responding to how I'm doing it? It's not always what I'm doing, how I'm doing it. Scan for tension and then practice letting it go, primarily through the breath. So, a practice in meditation, a practice in conscious breathing is an inherently necessary step. The second is learning how to move slowly, to slow down everyday actions like how we eat, how we move about in the world, and listening to the inner voice, the quietest voice speaking, as if you have an eternity to do anything. One of the stories I love to share with my students is a learning I received along the way where I learned how to do so much less and get so much more done. And it's employing exactly this willingness to move slowly and intentionally. And in the process, letting life come to me rather than me always working so hard to make things happen. Thirdly, as a practice, accept experience. Live each moment fully and intensely. Be in that moment so that the past stops haunting you. And as well, anticipating what's coming next. Just be really here now and accept this experience for what it is, which is self-defining. This moment defines what you are. Anything you're dragging along from the past or you're anticipating about the future cannot define who you are because it's not here. This moment is what's going to define you. So if you live this moment fully, life inherently changes and inherently becomes more natural. And then lastly, choosing innocence over knowledge. What's meant by knowledge is all the things that we've collected along the way, all the rules, all the right ways of doing things. Begin your life each day fresh, or as it's known, with beginner's mind. Choose to be childlike, innocent even in your approach, and recognize that the result will be seeing things in ways that you didn't expect. Experiences that you may in the past have conditioned yourself into believing would be a particular way transform because of how you're approaching them. It's referred to as innocence over knowledge, but it's really innocence over conditioning.
We began the episode asking these questions. What is your reason for work? Why do you work? And now, with these concepts and practices, we offer a new question. How are you being natural?
So I want to leave us with a quote, and it's from the Song of Mahamudra, which is the foundational bit of writing upon which Tantra exists. The void needs no reliance. Mahamudra rests on naught. Without making an effort but remaining loose and natural, one can break the yoke, thus gaining liberation.
Conversations on Healing and Growth is produced by Ben Umstead and Martin Perkins, with editing and music by Ben Umstead.